The following broadcast is intended for a right-wing audience. Communist discretion is advised.
Welcome to the show. I am your host, LB Muniz, and this is the Been Awake podcast for better sense making, or at least it will be when it's on, when it gets posted to the feed. But I am doing the live in Twitter Spaces as well, or X Spaces if you're there. And I had a few things that were on my mind. We're in the car today. It is funny when you spend your life on the road, kind of as I do, how comfortable you get doing things in your car, like talking on the phone or setting up a camera with a light. We're in a public parking garage, and maybe some other things like going to the bathroom when there's not a toilet nearby. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. A couple of stories that I wanted to talk about tonight, and then of course, if you are listening live, and if you want to hang out, talk, argue about something, anything, that's what I said. Let's argue about X. That's what I put on at least the social media platform. Title's going to be called something different, but if you want to argue about something, talk about something, let's do it. It's a lot more fun to have conversations than always monologuing to the camera, although I can go for a while. A couple of stories that I wanted to talk about. First, this morning when I was at the gym, I was listening to Tucker Carlson Chris Cuomo on Tucker Carlson, because he can't seem to disappear from the news cycle, and maybe that's just because he's a Cuomo, or maybe it's because he's actually good. There's this weird thing about Cuomo where he is, on the one hand, incredibly insufferable, and yet he's managed to make it this far. So is he just one of those people that fails upward, or does he actually have something to say? I don't know if he has something to say in the way that I would say Tucker Carlson has something to say, but I do think that he has something to teach us about what helps you get, I guess, maybe what helps you get ahead, but also what can kind of keep you safe, even if you leave the highest levels of corporate media and find yourself in quote unquote independent media and still want to act like you're this cool guy. Another story that I wanted to talk about today, breaking news, just to kind of talk about a little bit, because funny enough, I've been sketching out stuff because I wanted to talk about Ukraine again, because I think it's such an important topic for people to make sense of. And, some of the people listening to the show, you're definitely going to be pretty well read on the goings-ons there and the history of it. And I've covered it on my show a few different times. I mean, I think I posted right after the invasion that, welcome to World War III. Now, thankfully, it hasn't been total war. And if Trump has its way, I'd like to believe that it won't get to that. Now, maybe a conflict is ultimately inevitable, but we can at least try and avert a crisis while it exists. Try to avert a crisis for right now. The situation on the ground as it exists is one that shouldn't have existed, should not continue to exist. Certainly from the American right standpoint. Douglas Murray wrote an article over the weekend saying, how did the American right go wrong? Well, it's not that we went wrong. It's that we stopped caring about what warmongers have to say, because we've seen time and time again that those policies don't work. They make the world worse. And frankly, if I could be so bold as to say, the American right in particular, different from, I think we're all infused with two things. We're infused with recognition and an understanding that, in fact, there are things that we need to face about ourselves as an American polity, whatever that actually exists as, and we need to stop being so idealistic. And there's a certain form of pragmatism that has crept into the politics of the American right, and I think that's a good thing. My whole life, and even before I was born, most Republicans could only call to the Reagan Revolution, and there was a lot of good feelings about what Reagan accomplished or stated to accomplish. But of course, if we look at it with a few decades behind us, we see that, well, a lot of the compromises, let's say, of the Reagan times were still problems 30, 40 years later, and in fact, they only got worse. specifically immigration and specifically, well, to a lesser extent, gun control, right? But certainly immigration, right? This was supposed to be the big compromise. This is how Washington works at its best. At least that's what I was told growing up. And yet here we sit with millions and millions of illegal immigrants who have entered the country, making things worse for everybody, for native-born Americans, for legal immigrants, and also for the illegal immigrants themselves. The only people that benefit from the system are the NGOs, for one, 2, the cartels, and 3, the Democrats. Those are the people who actually benefit from this. And I guess anybody who feels like they should have their burrito, have limo service to your home for a fraction of the cost of what it would otherwise be. So talk a little bit about that. And then the other thing, and we'll start with this one just because it's a fun little way to start. Department of Education lays off nearly 50% of its workforce. So this is ABC News. It just came out today. So it says Department of Education has initiated mass layoffs on Tuesday night, reducing its workforce by nearly 50%, sources told ABC News. The reduction in force, quote unquote, notices began to go out at about 6 p.m. Some 1,315 employees were affected by this, leaving 2,183 employed by the department, according to senior official at the Department of Education. So, I don't know, maybe you can help me with the math at home. Let me know if I'm right or if I'm wrong. But nearly 50%, 2,183 versus 1,315. Now, I'm not a math whiz, but if I just try to add those numbers up in my head, I get something approximating, 3,498. So 3,498. If I was going to take half of that number, I would get what? Dang it, I'm not wearing my Apple Watch. I'm actually going to have to do this math. I would get 3,498, divide that by 2. I would get 1,007, so like 1,700, and we're only laying off 1,300. So where's those extra 400 people, and why don't they get laid off? But never underestimate the way that the corporate press can spin a win for us, make us feel excited, and it actually still be a loss. Now, of course, they're putting a headline of this out like it's a bad thing. Of course, most of us think it's a good thing, but let's keep reading for a little bit, and then we'll pivot. Impacted staff will be placed on administrative leave starting March 21st, a statement from the Education Department said. The statement also said that the Department of Education will continue to deliver on all statutory programs that fall under the agency's purview, including formula funding, student loans, Pell Grants, funding for special needs students, and competitive grant making. They go on to say a bunch of stuff. Wrapping up the article, it says they released a statement saying firing without cause nearly half the Department of Education staff means they are getting rid of the dedicated public servants who help ensure our nation's students have access to the programs and resources to keep class sizes down and expand learning opportunities for students so they can grow to their full brilliance. The Trump administration has abandoned students, parents, and educators across the nation. Well, we know this isn't true. We know that the United States is not number one when it comes to education. We know that we spend more money than everybody else, but hey, it's nice to see that. I worry sometimes that I sound too much like a Trump fanboy on my podcasts, but I will take the wins where I can get it, right? So, and I'm not going to try and balance my coverage, although I do think it's shitty that he wants to go after Thomas Massie. That's another story that I saw, another headline that I saw recently. Then, I wonder who else might be influencing that decision on the part of the president. But take a win where you can get it. This is something that people on the right, conservatives, libertarians, of which I'm a former adherent to, amongst other ideologies, have all said we don't need a federal Department of Education. They do more harm than good. And in fact, we know that these are the types of institutions that push the DEI and gender ideology on the American public. So anything that gets these people fired is a good thing. Frankly, the more federal workers that get fired is a good thing. We have how many millions of jobs in the market right now that you can go and get? Go get that. Learn to code. Or hey, pick up a factory job, because at least you'd be actually serving the economy at that point. So the other big news that we talked about at the beginning of the show is that there is that right now, we'll see, there's talks of a ceasefire in Ukraine. Cuomo and Carlson talked about this a lot in their podcast. And, one of my thoughts, it was a 2-hour, 48-minute conversation. I think it's worth checking out. And one of the sad things, and part of the reason why I figured, hey, I may as well try and do the Spaces thing here, because if there's something that I think, well, I'll just talk about my personal life, right? And I even, if I go back into my memories, quote unquote, on Facebook and other social media, I see there was a time in my life where I was far more vocal and open about my political opinions. Now, if you want to find it, if you want to see them, you have to come find me, LB Muniz. You have to come to my X page. You have to read the Substack at beenawake.com. You have to subscribe to the podcast. But I really try in my day-to-day life to not engage in political conversations with people who don't know what they're talking about. If for no other reason than as you get older, as you get busier, as you get out of school and you're actually working for a living, you realize that it's not worth the time and investment to convince your coworker of a particular policy or worldview that you might hold. It's far more beneficial to just let it roll off your back like water off of ducks and to move on to the next more productive thing you could be doing. At the very least, this is what I've found works in my life. And I've also found when it comes to my family life that it's a lot easier to not go to war. I have at different times. In fact, the Ukraine issue in particular is one of those things that I have talked about with my family at length at different points in time. So, you pick your battles, but there's no need to go to war over every single culture war issue if there is disagreement in your professional life or in your personal life. Hey, that's just how I look at it. I could be wrong. You tell me what you think. Come back to another one of these and argue that point with me, because maybe there's a convincing counter-argument, and I am somebody whose mind can be changed by arguments. So, reading from antiwar.com by Dave DeCamp, U.S. resumes military aid intelligence sharing for Ukraine. So the Trump administration has lifted its pause on military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine following talks between the U.S. and Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday. U.S. officials have said the move came after Ukraine signaled it was open to a 30-day ceasefire if Russia agreed. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the U.S. proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation, the U.S. and Ukraine said in a joint statement. The United States will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. The United States will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. One of the things that I think is a hallmark of the Trump administration is how quickly things move in the press. I think it would be fair to say and fair to point out to all you good people listening that these sorts of things, to the extent that they happen, I'm not saying it would happen exactly this way, I'm not saying it happened like this every single time, but to the extent that these things happened, I think it's fair to say they actually would happen like this. We're talking negotiations break down one day, it seems like the world is ending, and then about a week and a half later, everything moves in the direction that the player who's holding the cards wants. In the specific context, we're talking about the United States. Now, 100%, Trump is moving against the invested interests of the world, the post-World War II, Bretton Woods Agreement world order. Everything that they stand for, he is, to a greater or lesser extent, pushing against. Certainly, as it relates to the war in Ukraine and the expansion of NATO, he is working against it because he'd rather be remembered as a peacemaker and a deal maker than somebody who led us into war. And maybe, and hopefully, he actually does believe that war isn't actually good for everyone. And as I said in my previous episode, if maybe we have a military-industrial complex, those resources would be better put securing the borders. Let's start there, and let's see what happens as a result. So far, as of tonight, there's been no reaction from Moscow. Russian President Vladimir Putin has previously rejected the idea of a temporary ceasefire, saying in January he wouldn't accept some kind of respite for regrouping forces and rearmament with the aim of subsequently continuing the conflict, and that he wanted a long-term peace based on respect for the legitimate interests of all people, all nations living in this region. Moscow also has the momentum of the battlefield on its side, as its forces continue to make gains in eastern Ukraine and are pushing Ukrainian troops out of Russia's Kursk Oblast. Here's the fact. If you didn't see it, let me tell you right now. Russia had some major wins on the battlefield. You know, funny enough, stuff like that isn't actually being talked about as much as other things. I'm just going to click on this really quick to see if this has a better, let's see. Now, this is just a bunch of random bullet points. You know, I haven't really gotten into the nitty-gritty in the war just because, gosh, who has the time? I actually know somebody. I know somebody who every day on their lunch, they watch like this one YouTube video and he'll sit there like, oh man, well, these Ukrainians, they got to step it up. They got to move forward. You know, we got to do this. You know, it's Putin the dictator. Putin the dictator. But, so Russia has rejected the idea of a ceasefire. And so has Zelensky. Repeatedly rejected the idea of a ceasefire, continue to read from the piece, and his openness to a 30-day truce marks a significant shift in his position. U.S. officials had said that the pause in U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing would only be lifted after Ukraine made it clear it was willing to work for peace. Ukrainian delegation, quoting, has made something very clear, that they share President Trump's vision for peace. So, you know, didn't elaborate on potential security guarantees. Clearly, the signal that they're going to start resharing intelligence and, you know, any of the ships that were going to Ukraine can now pass into it means that for those of us who actually want the war to end, it might not happen as quickly as we want. What will be interesting to see, and what we'll have to keep our eyes on, is if and when the ceasefire doesn't happen, will Trump stop the aid again? Will he rail it back? Will he allow it to continue? How much pressure is he actually willing to exert on Zelensky to bring him to the table and to, the fact of the matter is, ultimately make concessions with Russia? I don't see how else we can, I don't see another way around it, personally. And that brings me to the last thing that was at least on my mind tonight, which was Tucker Carlson recently had Chris Cuomo back on his podcast. They had talked about a year ago, kind of Chris Cuomo had been fired from CNN. He was moving on to News Nation. And I find that it's tougher these days to pay attention to left of center and left-wing voices, just because, again, talking about that input-output, like how much time do you really have? How much anger do you really want to devote to something that's going to be gone tomorrow? Now, if you want this to be my full-time job, and if you want me to actually, you know, talk shit about these people on a daily basis, well, all you got to do is go to BeenAwake.com, subscribe with your email address, consider becoming a paying member, buy me dinner. That's the cost of a year's membership. And hey, that's enough of a pitch. I don't really pitch as much anymore, but you know, I am a salesman in my core, a dirty salesman, as I said recently to a customer. So there's just a few things that I wanted to talk about. And in particular, I find the character of Chris Cuomo fascinating, right? Here you Italian, political family, good-looking guy, in good shape, takes care of himself. And yet he is and remains a committed institutionalist. And that ultimately, I think, is the defining characteristic of Cuomo that makes him so frustrating to talk to, or so frustrating to listen to, but also interesting in these exchanges with Carlson. They have an interesting rapport where they're willing to take just jabs at each other, but there's a substantive conversation. And I'm not saying that it's lost, because I'm not sure anybody was really having those conversations, but I do think that there's a certain degree to which where in the common world, in the world of default Americans, people go from 0 to 100 real quick. As soon as you voice any kind of skepticism of a political opponent, left or right, as it exists, most people's shields immediately go up. They go to red alert and they're ready to launch all the torpedoes they have at their opponent as quickly as they can to try and leave them in the dust. And at least the benefit of having a conversation, and I think one of the benefits of people who listen to Tucker Carlson in particular, and other forms of new media, is they actually know how to have a conversation. That's one of the interesting things I've noticed is if I'm talking to somebody who's more plugged into the long form podcast ecosphere, they're more likely and willing to have a conversation, even if there isn't a complete meeting of the minds. And again, let's be honest, most of the time there's better things to talk about. But one thing that came up again and again, right? And a lot of it circles around this question of what is Zelensky? Is he a symbol for democracy? Is he a beacon of hope for the Western world? Or is he a dictator? And what makes a dictator? Now, I've talked about on my show numerous times that what a dictator is really just somebody we don't like. That tends to be the term we use for dictator, right? We don't call the king of Saudi Arabia a dictator, even though ostensibly most Americans are opposed to monarchical forms of government. Certainly people don't call the Pope a dictator, even though he is technically sovereign over the Catholic Church. But we do call people like Putin a dictator, even though he's been elected multiple times, with qualifiers, of course. And, we tend to call people like the leader of Venezuela a dictator, but not the leader of Brazil, unless we don't like the leader of Brazil. And one thing that's been really interesting with Carlson as he's been talking to people recently is he's been saying, like, what actually he's actually asking this question, a question that a lot of us were asking outside of mainstream circles for a long time. It's like, what actually makes somebody a dictator? What actually are the criteria? Is the criterion, squashing dissent? Is the criterion not allowing for religious freedom? Is the criterion suspending elections? Is the criterion all these things? Yes? Well, in that case, he qualifies. But for somebody like Cuomo, that's not something that they can contend with, because in order to accept, even if you lay out the criteria and say, hey, by these criteria, it seems to me that this guy kind of qualifies as what we would call a dictator. Even if we say that, you can't accept that. It's cognitive dissonance. Like, well, no, because their Constitution allows for it. So as long as the Constitution allows for something, I guess technically speaking, that is legal, but that removes the question of, is it right? And as we've kind of already stated before, there's plenty of democratically elected people that we've called dictators for one reason or another. And it makes this word very muddy and very not useful, in my opinion, to conversation. But what Cuomo kept coming back to multiple times during the interview, even if he said he agreed with Tucker on a lot, was the fact that he ultimately has faith in the institutions, and he wants the institutions to continue to exist. What separates him from us is that we realize that that these institutions either shouldn't exist or they should be serving a different master. Well, I hope you guys liked today's episode. Do me a favor if you would be so kind. Go to BeenAwake.com, subscribe with your email. Let me know a topic you want to talk about, maybe. Join me in one of these spaces and follow me on all social media, especially X, at the LB Moniz.
The mission of better sense making continues. Go to BeenAwake.com.